Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank AI Medical Services for so kindly supporting making this event possible. I think this demonstrates in the best way the strong relationship between Japan and Singapore, that I even have this opportunity now to be in Japan because of the business track that we have between the two countries. Thank you very much. So again, also I want to thank the opportunity to be with all my friends, old and new, that I've made now in Japan. So today I will talk about the potential of artificial intelligence in GI diagnosis in Singapore. So this is really like a wish list. I'm dreaming about something good coming to fruition in the future. And the 4 areas that I identified as something that AI can really help us as gastroenterologists, particularly in Singapore, but also patients who suffer from digestive diseases as follows: gastric cancer, Helicobacter pylori, gastritis diagnosis, video capture endoscopy interpretation, and I think the most challenging, the most exciting will be in the diagnosis or the detailed diagnosis and management of functional gastrointestinal disorders. Now, for gastric cancer, I put up there GSAP. I'll tell you what it stands for as well. But this is just my picture of how many Singaporeans dream of Japan as a land of beautiful culture, delicious food, and a very nice environment to be with friends. Okay, so we have heard that AI has developed many strong potential for us in making diagnosis of neoplasia throughout the entire gastrointestinal tract. So here you can see from diagnosing invasive gastric cancer to even small bowel polyps and tumors, and down throughout the whole entire gastrointestinal tract maybe, which means even to the colon. And even more exciting and potentially very helpful for doctors practicing endoscopy outside of Japan in particular will be to allow us to be better able at making diagnosis of early diseases like early gastric cancers, more difficult diagnosis like Helicobacter infection, and other early kind of diseases in the gastrointestinal tract. There are differences in the way we practice between Singapore and Japan. I know that and respect very much how detailed Japanese endoscopists take much time to slowly examine the gastric surface for early signs of gastric cancer. In Singapore, we often do a very fast examination and do not do such a detailed examination of the gastric mucosa. So having a tool like the AI to help us to identify suspicious areas to better target our biopsies will be extremely helpful. Now I want to tell you about GSAP. GSAP is a Singapore special program for the study of gastric cancer. It stands for Gastric Cancer Epidemiology Program study in Singapore. This was started more than 10 years ago, and it recruited about 3,000 patients who are considered to be high risk for gastric cancer. And these are Singapore people who are of Chinese ethnicity, aged 50 years or older. And these patients have regular gastroscopy and biopsies every 2 years. So this is just one of the early results from this big survey. This paper was published in 2006. So again, it's for people in Singapore who are over age of 50. And then we particularly studied male Chinese because this is considered to be the highest risk group for gastric cancer. So based on this type of study, we were able to identify about potentially 95,000 people in Singapore who could have high risk for gastric cancer. I then did a cost analysis and found that it was cost effective to do gastric cancer screening in Singapore. And very recently, just this year, there's an exciting new study published by this same group from the National University Hospital, who formed this cooperative group called the Singapore Gastric Cancer Consortium. So they were able to develop a special tool called the Serum microRNA biomarker panel for detecting gastric cancer. So the Serum microRNA is a test to check for this gene expression from simple blood tests, just 2 tubes, and with a very rapid method for measuring the microRNAs that are implicated in the gastric cancer cells. So this test is called the GastroClear, and this is just a diagram of how the study or how the test is conducted. This is the interesting results. The group found that it performed very well for detecting stage 1 to stage 4 gastric cancers, over 80% and sometimes more than 90%. But where it didn't do so well was with high-grade dysplasia, where only about 60% were detected. So in my opinion, this would be a very important area that AI could potentially come in to help us improve our pickup of potential high-grade dysplasia that could be precursors for gastric cancer. So based on that study, the group also did a health economics and showed that indeed it was actually cost effective. So by using this microRNA blood test, they were able to increase the detection of early gastric cancer from 30 per 100 with the current practice of endoscopy to 40 per 100 cancers with this microRNA screening test. Perhaps with AI, the potential will go up even higher. The estimated cost for this test is about $175 per subject. The next area where I see a great potential for AI would be to help us in identifying and interpreting lesions found in the small intestine on video capsule endoscopy. I do this VCE or video capsule endoscopy frequently, but I find it very tiring to have to watch the video. And even with some of the rate markers and some of the rapid screening, it is still taking a long time, and sometimes it is quite challenging to be careful not to miss any potentially important lesions. Very often it's not the serious diseases that are missed, but it's the minor changes which I feel are important, and I'll explain that in a while. In my practice, I'm seeing more and more small erosions, some even small little ulcers, and some inflammatory changes in the small intestine in many patients who are supposed to have functional GI disorders. And I think this gives us a clue as some of the possible basis for their symptoms that can be treated more effectively with pharmacological agents. And finally, the area that I think that is most challenging in our gastrointestinal or gastroenterology practice is in the field of functional gastrointestinal disorders, as you have heard so elegantly from Dr. Marco earlier on. This world map just shows you how common dyspepsia is in general, and then especially in Asia, where it's one of the regions with the highest prevalence of at least uninvestigated dyspepsia, the majority of whom probably can qualify as functional dyspepsia. So we did this study across many countries in Asia about 10 years ago, and published this paper about 3 or 4 years ago, where we did a survey in Korea, in China, in Philippines, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and even in India. And we asked patients how satisfied were they with the diagnosis that they got from their doctors, and how satisfied were they with the management that they had received for their symptoms. So you can see that FD, functional dyspepsia, had a very, very high dissatisfaction or unhappiness from the patients about the management. That means here is showing about 2/3 of the patients with functional dyspepsia did not feel satisfied with the treatment for their condition. And in this study, we looked at what kind of treatments the patients with FD had received. The major treatment class was proton pump inhibitors, so 2/3 received PPI. And then the next common class was prokinetics, so over half of them got prokinetics. Here I'm just showing you that traditional herbal medicine was also commonly used among our Asian patients. So that was our Asian experience, but it is not confined just to Asia. So in fact, a major European Center for Functional Dyspepsia Study, Leuven in Belgium, led by Professor Jentek, whom you all know is like the major expert in functional dyspepsia. They had done a survey of the current treatment landscape for functional dyspepsia and came to the following conclusions: that the current therapies lack efficacy and or safety. And for most compounds, the exact mechanism of action and true value to treat FD remains unclear. Furthermore, the relationship between improvement of gastric function and symptom reduction remains controversial, and there are many hurdles to developing new treatments because of the very heterogeneous nature of FD. So how can we overcome some of these treatment challenges? I think before we even can do that, we need to think of how we are thinking about FD, how we are influenced by the way we think about FD, particularly by doctors and specialists from Western countries. So here I show you one paper from Europe where they are trying to implement guidelines to reduce the use of upper GI endoscopies because they don't want to use upper GI endoscopy for patients who may only have FD, and they want to limit it to detect only patients with gastric ulcers or gastric cancers. This is largely to save money for the healthcare system. But I put it up here that I disagree with this. I think we should do more endoscopy, more detailed testing if we really want to help our patients with FD. As you heard from Dr. Marco just now, there are many minor little changes in the digestive system, such as pancreatic enzyme deficiency that could be contributing to FD. So here, this is from an American group. Again, they're trying to reduce the use of upper GI endoscopy. So in the US, they're trying to limit upper GI endoscopy to only patients who are age 50 or older. And then they try to encourage more empirical trial of treatment with PPI and test and treat Helicobacter pylori. You heard already how low efficacy it is to use the various treatment classes such as PPI and Helicobacter treatment for FD. And then here in America, they're also trying to minimize the use of endoscopy in approaching the evaluation and management of FD. I would highly encourage that we in Asia should take a different direction, and so we should take advantage of the strength that we have in endoscopy. I think that the Western doctors do not like to do endoscopy, but Asian doctors, like in Japan and in Singapore, we love to do endoscopy because we think it gives us a lot more confidence about what we are dealing with. I think our patients with serious upper GI diseases such as gastric cancer and gastric ulcers develop them at a much younger age than in Europe and in America. So we should not listen to the Western experts, we should do our own approach. And I think that we can increase the value of endoscopy for functional dyspepsia if we can have more important and effective tools such as AI or artificial intelligence. So there are here 4 areas where I think that AI can increase the value of doing endoscopy for functional dyspepsia. So one is to help us to better recognize and diagnose Helicobacter gastritis in our patients. I have found that in Singapore, very often endoscopists miss the diagnosis of Helicobacter gastritis because they do not take enough biopsies. Most of the time, they only take 1 sample for the rapid urase test. I found that if you take multiple biopsies and send to a good pathologist, we uncover many more patients with Helicobacter gastritis. Another area where tends to be underdiagnosed because the doctors don't think about it is in eosinophilic esophagitis and celiac disease. You already heard about how the video capsule endoscopy could potentially help us to discover more patients with minor changes in the small intestine that could be contributing partly to the pathophysiology of functional dyspepsia. So for eosinophilic esophagitis, we are often advised to think about EOE when there are alert symptoms relating to swallowing, for example. But at the same time, even the experts recognize that the symptoms can be very non-specific. Furthermore, the way that our Asian patients express or describe their symptoms could be quite different from the way that the Western patients describe their symptoms. And then we are also taught that there are certain characteristic appearances of patients with EOE. But at the same time, even the experts tell us that endoscopy has low sensitivity because even normal looking endoscopy images may harbor patients who have EOE. So unless we take biopsies or we think to take biopsies, then we will miss these patients. So should we do more endoscopy, do better endoscopy, or take more biopsies? So certainly I think that with AI, it will help the doctors to more quickly, hopefully identify patients who may have EOE and then to zoom in and take biopsies from the esophagus for these patients. I think this is a very important area to develop because I know there are many pharmaceutical companies who are developing methods of delivering steroids to the esophagus. And so there'll be much commercial interest from the pharmaceutical companies if they can have a tool for the endoscopist to have more recognition and diagnosis of patients with EOE. Maybe you can even use this AI tool for clinical trials of treating EOE. So you could sell this technology to the pharmaceutical companies that are conducting these clinical trials. So I think this area of functional dyspepsia is, to me, an extremely key and important area to watch for the potential of AI in the future. The other area that beyond the esophagus, beyond the stomach, that we definitely must look into is in the duodenum. You've already heard about Professor Futagami's work on evaluating duodenal inflammation in post-infectious FD, and how others have also demonstrated that the immune activation in duodenal biopsies can correlate with disturbances in gastric functions. But I think we will miss the diagnosis of duodenal mucosal immune activation if the doctors do not even know how to recognize it on normal endoscopy white light and do not think about taking biopsies and are not processed by expert pathologists. So perhaps here, this is where AI may also help to alert the endoscopist that this patient's duodenum may show some very mild early signs of inflammation or mucosal disruption. and perhaps even identify eosinophils. So you can see that even in the global Rome Foundation guidelines, duodenal inflammation is now recognized as an important potential pathophysiology for FD. Then another area in the duodenum that can be implicated, that the duodenum is implicated for FD, is with celiac disease or gluten intolerance. My understanding is that people in Japan, the doctors especially, do not believe that the Japanese people suffer with gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, partly because of genetics. But I can tell you I felt the same way in Singapore about 10-15 years ago. But then I went to analyze the genetics, but also went to study the published literature and found that there's really no good research showing that there is no gluten disease in Singapore or in Asia. So in the past, we had this type of survey, which is supposed to show us that the major parts of the world with celiac disease is not in Asia, but is outside of Asia in Western European countries. But that's because a lot of the Asian countries did not do detailed studies. So this is just a small report of my study cohort. We had about over 30 to 40 patients with IBS by Rome 3 criteria. And in all these patients, I took duodenal biopsies and did very detailed, sensitive gluten serology and discovered that there were at least 30 of these over patients in a cohort of about 200 with signals of gluten sensitivity. And furthermore, all of them had improved their IBS symptoms after they went on a gluten-free diet. There are also publications emerging from China showing that there is indeed gluten sensitivity or celiac disease even in China. So here in this small series, they found 4 patients who are all of Han nationality. But you can see from here that the criteria that they're using to diagnose celiac disease are very difficult, very tough criteria. So there must be shortened villi, mucosal atrophy, and essentially the worst type of severity, the Marsh type 3 changes before they made a diagnosis of celiac disease. But I will share with you that there are many IBS patients who have very, very mild changes that do not fulfill the full celiac disease criteria, but nevertheless are definite changes associated with a reaction to gluten protein. And that these patients have been now reported from the West, from many centers. So finally, I think AI and endoscopy is great, but still the challenge is how do we as physicians better understand our patients' symptoms. As Dr. Marco had suggested, one of the difficulty is that the way the patients describe their symptoms and the way the doctor interprets the symptoms could be quite different. But then this is where artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning could potentially help us to understand ourselves better, because it has so much technology, so much detailed ability to bring all these very small little information pieces together. So finally, we should see that dyspepsia, which in my opinion is a very bad word because it doesn't mean anything in proper English, it's very challenging to diagnose because we are dependent on the patient to describe the symptoms. And how does the patient learn the language to describe the symptoms is from their mother. But the same thing happens with the doctors. The doctors also learn their language from the mother, but do the doctors and the patients have the same background, the same cultural environment, the same type of diet and the same socio-economic status. So there's, I think, a big divide between patients and doctors, and maybe instead of the AI learning from humans can start to learn from AI how we can integrate all this information to better help patients with functional dyspepsia. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.